Let me just mention that the person I spoke to, Nemanja Mitrovic, is the assistant dean in the PAC division of EGS and is principally responsible for these events from the technical side, but also sometimes the content side. And I think that our recent turn to digital, things digital, particularly in music, is certainly Nemanja's creation. And it's in that context that we host today Kejsi Reas, who is actually has been with the EGS for some time. It's a wonderful pleasure to welcome him back. Kejsi and I have only had a couple conversations, I think, over the years, maybe a few, but they have stayed with me very strongly. And so I'm really, really delighted to have him with us again. I want to cite a few of his works. I don't usually make very long introductions, but Kejsi is not as well known, I think, in the area of critical theory as he should be, in digital arts and so forth. He is certainly very, very distinguished. But so let me mention a few of these things for those of you who are not so familiar with his work. He's first of all, let me mention that he's been teaching in the Department of Design, Media Arts at the University of California since 2003. He's a professor there. And he also taught for a while at the University of Cincinnati, or actually he studied at the University of Cincinnati, where he played in a band with Scott Devendorf and Matt Berninger, who became members of the National in 2017. And became quite distinguished. And Kejsi was commissioned to create 4 music videos for them, which I want to mention for the band's album Sleep Well Beast. These are the System Only Dreams in Total Darkness, Guilty Party, Karen at the Liquor Store, and Day I Die. These are extraordinary videos that are really worth attention. In 2001, Kejsi launched, along with Ben Fry, a data visualization platform, I guess I would call it, processing, which is an open source processing language and an environment for the visual arts. And he co-authored subsequently Processing, a Programming Handbook for Visual Designers and Artists. And that came out with MIT and was reprinted in 2014. He's had a number of private and public collections, and I think that I'm always nervous overdoing it with listing things. So I'm going to, at this point, simply ask you to take a look at his faculty bio on the European Graduate School website. You'll see a full list there of his creations and work. And as you'll see why I'm so impressed with it, really. So with that, let me pass the screen to Kejsi, again with the warmest thanks that he's back with us, and it's great to see him. I understand he's the pandemic is leading to this abandon with the hair, which I think is quite successful. So anyway, Kejsi, thank you very much. And welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you also, Nemanja, for organizing this. So the first time that I visited and taught at the EGS was in 2015. And that's actually where the story of today's presentation begins as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get into it. So to be just very open and honest with you today, my mind is a bit scattered. I think we're all a bit scattered. It's the end of the academic term at UCLA this week. I'm opening a new online gallery on Friday, like a completely new platform for showing work and having group exhibitions in the browser. And in the United States, there's a rise in hate crimes against the Asian American community that is a real stressor here locally. With all that in mind, I'm going to do my best to really focus and narrow in on the topic of this presentation, this talk, which is about latent cinema. So I think with the idea of getting into a cinematic space, I'm going to switch off the light here. It's noon in California right now, but for me, cinema is very much of a space of the imagination, a space of dreams. It's a space for darkness where some stimuli is shut out to allow the mind to wander. The core of what we're going to be looking at over the next minutes are a series of 5 videos that I created in collaboration with Jan Werner. Jan is a composer, musician. I am very much someone who works in the visual realm. And these are really the first time that I've worked on a complete collaboration with somebody with such expertise and sensitivity to sound. So these are videos that are not scored, but the image and the sound integrate completely. What we're looking at right now are a few images from the Bitforms Gallery in New York. This is a show that went up at the beginning of 2021 and just came down a few weeks ago. We built these 2 walls in the space. This one's 8 feet high by 16 feet wide. Sorry, not in the metric system measurements for you. And on the other side of the gallery, there's a smaller square screen. And so the videos bounce back and forth between these 2 screens, one at a time. And each one of these video works as a loop that can continue, playing through, or they can be screened one by one. And I want to start off, before we jump into that, by looking at this diagram for a few moments. Sorry, it's even darker than I thought it would be. I'm going to turn the light back on. Okay. This diagram for me represents the world that I live within. It's a diagram of what I think of as visual technologies. I work in software. All of my work, well, it begins in the realm of ideas, and oftentimes begin with sketching on paper, but it ends up in the realm of software and in writing code. But I don't see software as being something that is separate from the history of the visual arts. I see it as being new opportunities for allowing things to move in different and other directions. But when I think about my work in software, I'm thinking very much about video, cinema, photography, printing, and painting. And I also think about the way that the media reproduces itself. I think we have reproduction going back hundreds of years, digital reproduction, which means, there's no original, that everything is exactly the same as the others, being able to move in a non-rivalrous way. I think we're still coming to grips with that as a culture and as a community of artists. And then also the move from creating things in an autographic way with one's hand to capturing images, and then later in video and in software being able to synthesize images completely from a set of rules or sets of instructions. So this is the realm that everything that comes after will be in reference to. I want to start off by looking at one of the 5 videos that are a part of the series. And these videos were created from 2018 to 2020. It was a really intense time of production and work, starting with exploration and then moving into the finished pieces. I just realized when I shared my screen, I didn't share sound. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and share the sound along with that. Just one moment. All right, so this is the 5th and final video in the series. It's called Not Now, No, No. It is an HD video. It's black and white with audio. It runs at 60 frames per second, and it's 4 minutes and 7 seconds. So we'll be watching the video in its entirety, and then we'll move on from there. So I would recommend just relaxing. If you can, turn off the lights. If you do have headphones, getting hooked up with that so you can experience this. Zoom is notorious for dropping frames, and so it's not at all an ideal experience. It's actually a bad experience for viewing the work. But I think the main, the majority of what is embedded in the work will hopefully come through. So here we go. So that's the end of the first, or the fifth video in the series, which could continue to loop each time. I think perception is quite different. So all of the videos in the series were made with GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks, and we'll get into in a minute sort of how I started working with those and why. Going back to the diagram we looked at a moment ago, for me, this work is about flattening software, photography, and video together. And I think also making reference to the histories of painting as well. But we will continue on with that. I wanted to give you an introduction of where we're headed before we start. So a brief introduction to learning 2015 through 2017. So I was actually sitting at breakfast in 2015 at the EGS. I was ready to teach that day when I saw this image for the very first time. I was having breakfast with Benjamin Bratton, and we saw these images together. I have to say, this image, regardless of what we all think about it, it really captured my attention in an intense way. It's not something that I really would think it would have captured my attention, but it certainly did. I guess to cut that story short, like I'm someone who's been looking at painting for all of my adult life, looking at painting really closely and in photography and in visual representation as a visual artist. I felt there was something captured in this image that I had never seen before. You know, I've spent a lot of time looking at fantasy art and fantasy illustration. I've spent a lot of time looking at, you know, mathematically generated art, and also at, you know, art created under the influence of different substances. And I felt that this image captured something distinct and different, something I had never seen before. So where did this image come from? There were some images that were leaked onto the internet. I don't know if they were leaked, but they were, I think, unintentionally seen. And so a few days later, these engineers at Google published this blog post explaining where these images come from, the idea of inceptionism, and which was essentially the Deep Dream software at that time. For me, 6 years later, I really enjoyed going back through this material over the last few weeks preparing for today as a way of remembering this history. I think we move through things so fast that already these thoughts and these impressions had started to leave. So what is going on with Deep Dream? The idea was that as we develop, as not we, but as engineers, computer scientists develop neural networks to recognize images, they do a lot of training. So if you train a network on hundreds or thousands of pictures of a banana, in order for them to be able to recognize what a banana is, those networks are a set of weighted values that allow for this image recognition to happen. So for example, if I present an image to this trained net, is there a 10% chance there's a banana in this photo? Is there a 90% chance that there's a banana in this photo, etc.? And they're trained on different categories of images. And so I think the fundamental idea, which I think feels relatively straightforward after the fact, but what happened with Deep Dream was the idea of, let's get a view inside of this trained network and get a sense of what it sees or what it imagines a banana to be. So on the left, we start with pure noise, digital noise, I think is a good clarification. And we iterate in order to get a glimpse into what this trained network imagines as a banana. And if we do that with other categories of images like feather boa, radio telescope, ladybug, we begin to understand how this trained machine learning system is categorizing these different image types in a way that's, I think, probably radically different from how we do. But it is a way that's effective in a way that works. So starting with noise, these are the kinds of images that begin to emerge. But starting with an existing image, for example, a snapshot of a plate of spaghetti, these are the kind of images that begin to emerge. I mean, this image is really, I think, strong. It elicits a strong, maybe emotional or intellectual response. I'm not sure, but it's really striking. And so Deep Dream, some people, you know, aesthetically really adopted it and went on with it. Other people were really repelled by it, but it is what it is. And it was a really interesting idea. My way more into this machine learning to create the videos was through different techniques. This was a really important paper for me. Unsupervised representation learning with deep convolutional generative adversarial networks by Radford and others. The first images that I saw with GANs that really captured my attention are these. These are small images, so it makes sense to look at them small on the screen. But these are images that were generated from training on images of bedrooms. And so the idea is that the network is fed hundreds or thousands of images of bedrooms, and these images are generated back from the system, completely, you know, without reference. They're generated from a set of values from the latent space, which we'll talk about again in a moment. I think these images are really fundamental to the primary idea that I want to focus on today, is that unlike prior photographic media like photography or film, where you have a set number of frames, you know, one 35 millimeter image and another 35 millimeter image, in the latent space, you can generate an indeterminate number of images in between. So if you look on the left and the right of each of these rows, you can see a starting image and another image, and you can see the interpolation in between. And so the granularity of that interpolation is as fine as it can be. We no longer need to think about images that are fixed for moments in time. We can actually generate an arbitrary number of images between 2 points within the latent space. We'll talk about that more also in a bit. The other paper that's been really essential for the work that I've done in creating the films that you saw one of, and we'll see two more, is the progressive growing of GANs for improved quality, stability, and variation. So if you remember some of those images, the bedroom images we saw before, and you look at these bedroom images, it's the second block from the top, you can see how there's a notable difference in fidelity. But at the same time, you can see the hallmark of a lot of these GAN-based systems are where things go wrong. For example, if you look at the airplanes at the top, or you look at some of the birds towards the bottom, you can see how there's no real recognition from our perspective of how we see in these systems. You can see these impossible forms, impossible shapes based on how we perceive the world, which I think is an important distinction. Reflected in these different GAN-based systems. I think this diagram goes a long way towards showing this quick evolution, not necessarily towards something better in my opinion, but the changes in GANs over a few years. So on the left, you see DC GAN, which is that first paper we were looking at, and the kind of fidelity at which faces can be generated by training on a data set of thousands upon thousands of celebrity photos. And then 2 years later, with the progressive growing of GANs on the right, you can see the resolution is enhanced and also the recognition of, I guess, fidelity of the recreation of faces. But you can also see all the errors and the bugs in the generated faces as well, particularly kind of on the backgrounds and the edges around there. So for all the films that I produced, the first 2 were made with the DC GAN algorithm on the left, and the last 3 were made with the progressive GANs on the right, but disturbing them and distorting them in a way through the training set that I used. Another machine learning system at the time that really grabbed my attention and led to the years of work that I did within this was the Pix-to-Pix by Isola and others. And this was a demo for the Pix-to-Pix system written by Christopher Hesse. And what you see in this tightly crafted edges to cats is that you can see the input in the box on the left, and then Pix-to-Pix processes that into the near photographic image on the right. And so this is sort of an expected use of the system. I made these a few days ago for you. You can see this really crude cartoon of the cat that I drew on the left, and then you can see on the result on the right. And what I find really interesting about this is not at all these 2 images, but the relationship between the 2, but even more importantly, the collapsing of the space between drawing and photography, which is something I had never seen before in the same way. And then here, for example, is a really crude cartoon that I drew for you, and what we see as the output there as well. So, of course, this system was made and trained on outlines of cats and images of cats and comparing the 2, so that when we have an outlined image, we translate into the photographic image. But of course, it doesn't know anything about cats in the way that we imagine that we know things about cats. So for example, if I draw this Dungeons and Dragons type monster here, you can see how it translates into the result on the right. If I draw a really crude cartoon of a flower pot and a flower, you can see how that again is translated into cats. And I think even the most absurd example here, if I draw a really crude cartoon of a table, you can see the system trying to, with its training, convert that into a cat-like form. So the decoupling of, I would say maybe to start that over, the lack of a filter is what I find so interesting about this system. The cognition that we have, that we are always seeing the world through these different constraints and filters, is completely gone and allows unexpected things to emerge. So what I was even more interested in than the work done by these different research teams was the initial work created by artists working with these tools. So I was very influenced at the time by Mario Klingemann's work, Quasimondo's work. So these are some images that were posted in June 2016 onto his blog at Flickr, which use the same kinds of GAN techniques that we've been looking at, but use a different kind of training set. I think that's the agency that we have with machine learning, is the data that we train on and then how we train those 2 things together. And then also a few years later, Memo Acton's Learning to See Gloomy Sunday. This is a video that Memo had just kind of, I think, made really informally, had sitting on his hard drive for quite a while, and then eventually started to share with people. And I think other people were able to recognize, and then Memo was later able to recognize what is, I think this is a really significant piece of work in thinking about machine perception and machine vision. We'll look at a little bit of this. So here the machine learning system has been trained on images of the ocean, clearly. And we have the input on the left and then the output on the right. So here, it's been switched over to the category, I don't know if it's category of flames or category of fire, but now these like same very casual video images of maybe things lying around on the desk or in the bag are imaged with a different set of constraints. And then lastly, we'll switch once again to a different category of training. So I'm going to move forward. So this brings us to my origin with working with machine learning and GANs. It starts with this series of work, which are still ongoing, related to thinking about and looking at the natural world. So this work begins without machine learning. It begins with a set of studies that I produced in 2018. What we're looking at right now are images of Stan Brakkage's film Mothlight. Stan Brakhage was a very influential and I think extraordinary American filmmaker, experimental filmmaker. And Mothlight was a film that he made entirely by collage method of taking material from the natural world. In this case, you can see leaves, you can see moth wings, and sandwiching those between clear images of film, and then using an optical printer to produce the final film from there. This is a 16mm film. And so the idea is to get away from the constraints of needing a camera, of working with representational like images through a lens, and working directly with the material in this direct way. So let's look a little bit at another film that Brakhage made with the same technique, but made much later in 1981, called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And so because this is a 35mm film, because the film was made in this way, every frame is different from every frame that comes before. The images are not captured at 24 frames per second and then played back at 24 frames per second, but instead these collages are played back at 24 frames per second. And unlike the Mothlight film, Garden of Earthly Delights also uses some post-processing techniques, chemical techniques, and then also compositing with the optical printer. So because we're working with film projectors, we're constrained to the 24 frames per second. So I had an idea. It's a very casual, simple idea that I wanted to take this idea of these films, but I wanted to think about them in the present, at that time, 2018. And so here I am in Colorado. This is not where Brakhage made those films. It's a little bit away, but it's the exact same biome. So I'm in the Aspen area in Colorado, and I am moving up and down the mountain. I'm collecting materials. And then here I am in my temporary studio for the week, kind of organizing and laying out the different fresh materials, and then also some not fresh materials, and then compositing them on the bed of the scanner like this. The idea being that in 2018, I'm not working with film, I'm working with digital technologies. And what I'm going to do is to carefully compose on the scanner bed. I'm going to take a high resolution scan of the imagery there. And then I'm going to cut that imagery up, moving down the scanner, moving one column to the right, and then moving down the scanner again. So it's analogous to Brakkage's technique, but using, I would say, the media of today, of the moment, rather than these analog media. And so these are not finished works, but they're studies. So let's have a look at this first one here. And because I'm not constrained by the projector, I'm also able to modify the frame rate. And so after a lot of trial and error, I pushed these down to 12 frames per second. In the same way that there's artifacts from the analog media here, there's a tremendous number of artifacts from the digital capture process and digital media too. There's small bugs moving across the screen as things are being scanned, and those show up in sort of a bright colored glitches, things like that. So this is another study, made a few days later. And here the images have been processed more. And it has a stronger relationship, I think a clear relationship to some earlier experimental films by different artists such as Man Ray. So that's a sense of that. And then what we're looking at now is an image of using all of those scans, which when they're cut up, it's thousands upon thousands of images. Actually, it's over 100,000 images. And using those over 100,000 images from those scans as a training data set for my beginning to explore GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks. And so these images are not from the scans, but they're generated directly from the trained model. So these are completely synthetic images. And I continued the studies with those. So this is number 11, which is translating those ideas into these original ideas from Brackage of working with the direct materials from the natural world and then moving those through GANs. And here we're moving through the latent space of this trained model. So I think you can see some relationship between the original film exploration of Stan Brackage, but things have now been moved far away from that original origin source and moved into something new entirely. And this was one of my first experiences with the idea of the latent space, which I'll talk about more in a little bit to clarify, and how to move through the latent space to generate cinematic images. Okay, so before we do that, I want to show this one final piece. And for me, this was the next step, was to move things out of video and move them directly into software, my primary media. And so this piece is called Earthly Delights 1.1, 2019. So it is a piece of custom software, runs on a computing machine, and it has variable dimensions. So what we're going to look at right now is not the live software, but a capture from that software. And I'll say a little bit about it as we watch it. So the idea with this piece is to break entirely free from the constraints of the machinery of film. With film, we have cameras to capture at a certain rate. We have projectors to play back at a certain rate. Video also has a lot of constraints as well. But now within software, we are free to play the frames back in any order. So we don't have to show frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, but we can show frame 1, frame 500, frame 6, frame 120. We can move in a nonlinear way through the frames that have been output from the machine learning model. And we also have total control over the frame rate as well. So we're no longer constrained to 2997 of NTSC or 24 frames per second of a standard 16 millimeter projector. Sometimes these images are played back at 1 frame per second, sometimes 4 frames per second, and sometimes 60 frames per second. We now have complete control over the rhythm and pacing and of time, as well as nonlinearity of the images. So for me, I think those ideas around this piece of work, the idea of breaking from those constraints of cinematic and video media is what's most important about it. It really works for me as a temporal visual cinematic experience as well, but I know just from experience of showing it around that it doesn't work the same way for everybody else. So when this piece of software loads, it loads in a preset set of sequential images, and then from there plays them back in a nonlinear way and at different rhythms and paces, and also at different orientation. So this is a film of indeterminate duration. It has a beginning, but it need not have an end. It can continue to play and always be different. Fresh sequences of images are continuous rather than looping or linear media. So for me, that's the break from video media to software media. Okay, so let's slow down for a minute and look at GANs in more detail. So what are they? How do they operate? How do they work? What is the technique? What is the medium here? So in the last few years, I think all of us have been thinking about, reading about AI in a way that we really haven't before. It's really come to the forefront of a lot of our conversations and a lot of our thinking. But of course, we know that these ideas have been around for over 60 years, probably even before that. But some of the first formal conferences around the idea were from around that time. And there's a whole lot of domains. AI, A-Life, which is a domain that I was exploring a lot in the 1990s and became the origin of my work in software, machine learning, machine intelligence, and then more specifically neural networks and genetic algorithms. So we have this whole network of terms. What I'm going to speak about now more precisely are generative adversarial networks, and even more specifically, deep convolutional GANs. So that's where we're headed. We're really drilling down deep into something really quite precise. And it is these papers that I introduced at the very beginning. So I think that one thing to know about GANs are that they need to be trained. And how long does the training take? It can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks to a few months. So for some of the films or videos that we'll look at later, the training time took about a month. The training starts like this. And then over time, through the adversarial networks, form begins to emerge, definition and shape and texture and color begins to emerge. So this is after about 1,300 iterations. This is after 16,000 iterations of the training. And so periodically in these iterations, we'll take a capture in order to get a glimpse into how the training is going. This is after 22,000 iterations, after 100,000. And so here we can compare directly the beginning after 81 iterations to after 100,000 iterations. And we can see what we have in each one of these grid units is a set of random values within the latent space of this model as it's being trained. And over time, we move away from the undefined texture into a precise or more precise definition of form, color, texture, etc. And then as I get to the end of the training process, I start taking captures or looking into the training with more regularity. And so in working with GANs, one question is, what do you train on? How do you prepare the training set of hundreds of thousands of images? And the other is, how do you train and when do you stop the training? And so I'm not a great photographer, but I have spent a lot of time in the darkroom, printing photos and taking photos, and in digital imaging programs, manipulating photos too. And what I see towards the end of the process is more analogous to how we make those refinements in the darkroom through dodging and burning, for example. So if you look at each of these different iterations, you can see changes in the granularity. You can see the color shift and the color tone change from iteration to iteration. And so when we get down to the craft of this, the craft of being an artist working with GANs, I think part of that comes down to where you end the training, which version of the model is used to then generate the images from. And that's a very subjective and very intuitive thing, much as it is in photography. This is a time-lapse insight into the training. And what we're seeing here is hours of training, moving into days of training, time-lapsed. And you can see, again, we start without much definition. And then over time, each one of these different points, fixed points within the latent space, begins to emerge through the form and the texture. This is a 15-minute video. I'm going to stop it right here. And this is the end. This is what we have. This is an image within the GAN, within DC GAN. It's 100 numbers that range from -1 to 1. And this is the precise representation of a specific image within the latent space. So for example, this is a set of these 100 numbers. This is a set of those 100 numbers, a different configuration and a different configuration. And so this is the medium that artists working with GANs, DC GAN precisely, are working with. And I think this might be for me, the most important slide in the entire presentation. And what we see here are different ways of moving through that latent space, which means different ways of modifying those numbers slightly, those 100 numbers between -1 and 1, to generate time-based images. And so what you have on the left is one random point in the latent space transitioning through spherical interpolation to another point in the latent space. What you have in the middle is something that I think is unique to GANs. I've never seen it before in more traditional cinema or video techniques, but it's taking one of those numbers and wrapping it around. Like when you get to 1, you wrap it around to -1 rather than moving back down. And so it's not a cut because some percentage of the image remains the same, but some other percentage of the image changes. It's something completely unique to this medium. And then I'm really interested on what's on the right. What's on the right is changing a single value of those 100 numbers in the latent space. So this is that continuity of moving through the latent space that I think is such a radical departure from photography, video, and film, where we no longer have a set of fixed frames, but we can basically put as many frames in between two different points of the latent space as we want to slow things down or to speed things up. This is a further iteration on that final frame, where here we have a fixed point in the latent space, a set of precise 100 numbers, and we're moving one of those values up and then wrapping it around and then back to its starting point. And then we go to the second number and move it up, wrap it around and go back to the starting point, and then we go to the third number. So we do that for each 100 number. So it's a way of getting an insight into the potential of the imagery contained within that latent space. All right, our final section, compressed cinema. And these are the 5 videos created in collaboration with Jan Werner. And before we dig into that, I want to talk about one more precedent from the history of experimental cinema. And this is Ken Jacobs' Tom Tom the Piper's Son from 1969. This is a 75-minute film produced in 16mm and then printed at 35. And Tom Tom the Piper's Son was originally a silent film that was 10 minutes long. So this 10-minute film was expanded into 75 minutes by Ken Jacobs through the process of rephotography, cropping, changing the pace, slowing things down. And so this was very much a partial inspiration for the software-based garden work that we looked at before, the idea of expressing and, condensing and expanding time, and working with the rhythm against the regular, monotonous, mechanical, machine-like 24 FPS that we see in film. And so this work in compressed cinema is very much about the opposite. It is about taking a feature-length film and compressing it into, less than 10 minutes through using the frames of that film as a training set for a GAN, and then picking points within that latent space and moving between them in ways in order to produce something new from that existing source material. So instead of making a film from the world, we're taking an existing piece of cinema and expanding that world through the machine learning, through the training, and then compressing it into a unique and different piece of media. So this is the second in the series of videos to watch. This is Untitled 2, Kiss Me. And this one is 24 frames per second, and it's a 4-minute and 19-second piece. So we'll watch this in its entirety, and then we'll move back into the realm of the ideas of the work. And then the loop happens from there. So this is another 15-minute video that we'll just watch for a moment. I wanted to talk a little bit about the training for these videos, how to train the neural networks. And so this is an example of training one of those models. As we saw in the diagram before, this is a really early technology. It's been advancing really quickly. But at this time in 2015 with DCGAN, it's inherently extremely low resolution. And so these are 128 by 128 pixel images shown at their actual size, relative to the screen of the video here. And so the training set needs to be heterogeneous. So instead of just training on the full frame, there's a process of scaling and cropping that happens in order to have the training set have more different information. And that's really required for the model to not collapse on itself. It needs to have hundreds of thousands of images that are unique to each other, rather than like a typical film where one image is very similar to the one before. So this technique was developed for doing the training. And then this is what comes out of moving through the latent space of that training without any consideration for aesthetics or rhythm or pacing or timing or meaning or environment or anything. This is just sort of mathematically moving through things. This is what happens. This is what you get. So we have this inherently low resolution system, but at the same time, we have the ability in the latent space to move very precisely through it when we take the time to do that. And so the way the work proceeded is that myself and my technical assistant in the work, Heyman Cho, who was completely essential for this work for the 2 years that we were working on it, we would generate thousands upon thousands of raw, unedited images from the latent space. And this is a sampling of those like unedited images from the latent space. And then from there, I would cut those thousands down into a few hundred, down to about 100, and then we would move into only a few. So these are some that came out of that training. This is very much preparatory work. These came out of a different training, which became the foundation for that video that we were watching a moment ago. And so each of these 5 videos became a set of fixed locations within the latent space. And then the really tedious and long process of making the videos was about exploring the path in between these individual images. So this is a high dimensional system. There's a lot of ways to get from A to B. And over the course of a year, we developed many different unique and custom techniques for moving through the latent space in different ways. And so each film has these fixed points. And what I think is really the work for me was about basically walking that path in between these fixed points. These are some of the final images for the first video. And so the latent space, this is an example of one of the framed images. The latent space is really incredibly large. And there's lots of space within there that I just don't want to go. I don't want to look at those images or see those images. They're just kind of noise. And so this process is a really long process of refining and curating images in order to be more precise. So what we see here is these fixed points. You can see some themes transitioning from one to another and then coming back. This is the fixed frame from the third video and some individual images from there. Each training for each video had a lot of different possibilities. Sometimes the things coming back were extremely representational. Sometimes they were, at the edge of complete abstraction. And then I think the space that I found to be the most fascinating was a hybrid, somewhere in between, something that really fires the mind to try and force sense and out of these images where none really exists. I think this is really largely a pure experiential project, shutting down the conscious mind and experiencing the image and audio combinations together. So these are the fixed points from the 5th video, which is the first one that we watched about an hour ago. I'm going to wrap up soon. These are some of those images enlarged. And then I had intended to show this video, but I think I'm just going to show a short amount of it for time. And I will also share a link with you where if you want, you can see all of these works in, I would say, a more ideal format, not through Zoom. They're online and they can be viewed as you desire. But I do want to show a little bit of this one. You may have caught in the first video that we watched and the second complete video that we watched with sound that there are techniques such as cutting that are traditional in editing film video. 2 of the videos, 3 and 4, this one is being 4, don't use any cuts. So they're completely an uninterrupted walk through the latent space. And so I want to give you a sense of how that operates in this one, but I'm going to cut it short. Here we go. So I'll cut that there. Each of the 5 videos were each trained from a different source material. Each one has its own quality to the images generated through the latent space. And so each is really edited in a different way, focusing on different qualities. And also the audio for each then is different as well. So there are these 5 distinct explorations into these different areas. What I want to close with is this is a bit of a tangent, but this is a space where you can explore the work in more detail. Because of our current global moment, this exhibition went up in New York, but at the same time, we also released an online version as well. And it is at a new exhibition space called New Art City. And when you visit this URL, you can visit the show. I can bring the URL up again in a moment, but what I wanted to show you was just a quick walkthrough of the exhibition. So we're dropped down into the location of the gallery, the Bitforms Gallery, on the Lower East Side on Allen Street in New York. And we have sort of the context of the location of the gallery there. And then we kind of enter in. We see the work as it was presented in the gallery. And then we move outside of the gallery space into what I think of as really a more ideal way to view the works. We have these 5 pavilions in this imagined space outside of the gallery where each of the videos can be seen on its own. And they can also be seen in their looped format, which is, I think, the intended and desired format for these videos. So video 3 is by far the most in representation and feeling more like traditional video. 4 is the most abstract. And I think 5, the one that we started with, is in many ways the most conventional in its construction and oscillates a lot, moves back and forth between both styles of representation. So that's a quick tour through the browser-based installation. That's the end. Here are some more ways to explore. And then I'll just close on this slide. And then I will, let's see, stop screen sharing so we can all be more together in the space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kejsi. That was fascinating. I have a question to add to the ones in the Q&A, which maybe links them, if that helps. And it's the question, this comes from some experience with Raul Ruiz, who used to theorize. I had a chance to work with him for a while, and he used to theorize that what was going on in cinema, at least traditional cinema where you had 24 frames per second, was that the mind was dreaming between images. And he was suggesting that the real work was going on there. That was what really interested Raul. And you've, of course, shown a way in which in this latent space, and there isn't the same sort of, well, there can be with the cutting, but there isn't, there isn't the same sort of gapping or interstitial spaces at work, or it works differently. And I thought that might touch upon with a question about imagination, maybe something about perception. And I was picking up Kathleen Ruiz's name. I just wonder about imagination and dreaming. Maybe you could say a couple more words there, but please feel free to take any of the other questions in advance or with it, that question.
No, I really like that comparison to the difference between these video images and being in the cinema with all of this blank screen in between the frames that sort of get impressed. And I think it is a real difference. And 3 of the films I pushed to 60 frames per second as a way to really increase and like push that distance, or maybe I said 60 frames per second, to really push that and make a strong difference to traditional cinematic media. So I don't think I have a really, I guess I was like trying to push the video media as far as I could, and to make that distinct difference. But it does miss out on that quality of the projected image for sure. There are a lot of questions. I don't know where to begin. Does anybody have any ideas?
I could have also linked with Alan Ferguson, who makes a link to Bacon. I was seeing the same thing at certain points.
Yeah, I think
Francis
that's
and what you were saying about the demand on the viewer to make sense, or not the demand, but the struggle, the effort.
For sure. So in all of this work, there's a lot of artifacts of the medium. The same way that like early photography had a lot of artifacts and really early film did. The GANs have a strong influence on the nature of the media that gets generated through them. And that's originally why I started working with them, was that I think the phrase people use a lot is uncanny. They're very uncanny. They're very dreamlike. And a lot of imagery has a kind of distortion that has a reference to painters like Francis Bacon. It's true. Just things that come out of GANs tend in that way. And so you can choose as an artist working in the media to work with that or work against it. I think at moments, I think that level of abstraction is a really satisfying one for me, and I want to kind of work with it. Yeah, so and that's something that's, in ways of art making that allows for chance operations. The GANs really allow for that too. It allows for unexpected things to happen that you can then choreograph with. So yes, the Francis Bacon reference is right on point. But no, there were no Francis Bacon images used for training, to be clear about that. This is one from, if learning systems are ingesting data sets and producing unique imagery with each new iteration of the work, does an identifiable aesthetic start to develop? I think moving on to the Francis Bacon comment, I think people who have been working with GANs or have experience in the space can definitely see that really strong hand of the medium for sure. I think the role of myself as an artist working within the medium is really in manipulating the training data, the sets of images that are being fed in to get the results that are desired. And so a lot of trainings that I worked on were abandoned. A lot of trainings were adjusted and adapted to make them more homogeneous or more heterogeneous, to push them a different way. But I think a lot of the work too, just 2 more things, is in what parts of the latent space that I choose to present, or anybody chooses to present. There are spaces there that feel really directly related to the training data, but there's also things there that feel completely different from the training data, but still like have some of the quality of the cinematography left in them. And then I think maybe to the major point of what I was hoping to get to today, how you move through that latent space, how you get from point A to point B, is a large part of where the authorship and the choreography comes into play. Some designers who've been using GANs describe them as hallucinating. Do you find any utility in this term? You mentioned that the GAN imagines something in an image. Do you see them as seeing something that's not there? I think my initial interest in working with them was in being able to generate images that I had never seen before, that that aren't there in the training data, that aren't there in that source imagery. Hallucinating, I don't really find utility in that precise term, but in what it's referring to, yes, for sure. Nemanja or Chris, could you point me to one that you think is good? There's a few that move into Deleuze that I'm unfortunately not capable of answering, but I would love to hear thoughts about that in some form at some time. Here's an easy one. I'll do an easy one.
Okay.
For artists with no programming knowledge, are there currently any user-level GANs available? There, at the time when I started doing this work, the answer was no, but now in 2021, there are quite a few really good high-level tools that artists can use. The one that a lot of my students have been using is called Runway ML, and it allows you to work with existing data sets. I think that's something that has been emerging in the last few years, is that there's a lot of very large-scale data sets that are already trained that you can tap into and generate from and move through. But in Runway, you can also train your own data sets. And as these different algorithms have evolved, since 2015, you can begin to generate with smaller data sets and get higher fidelity results. I'm personally very interested in things that veer away from photographic representation, I think, as you could see through these videos. And so as GANs get better at recreating the world and recreating the photographic space, I become less interested in them. But it really just depends on what they're being trained on, as to what they produce. Can the root of this form be found in Dada surrealism? I think for sure, definitely, that is a strong reference, especially into going back into this idea of dreaming. And I think also, Chris, going back to your point, also this idea of like the cinema of Cocteau and other filmmakers really working within the dream space, particularly Maya Deren, I think also. I think filmmakers working within those spaces, for me, is a direct line into what can be created with GANs. But I think maybe a difference is in the quality of the images themselves, not being grounded in lens-based media or the way that the camera interprets light. I think it's a really good question. What do you think that we as humans can learn from how machines see and sense the world? I don't think I have a good answer to that, but I just wanted to put the question out there. I mean, for me, I work with software and I work with machines to get around my own aesthetic biases. I've been working with software now for over 20 years, and that is largely the reason why I started working with software, was to explore variations beyond what I can conjure up with my mind and my hand as a direct connection, to be able to use software as a thought augmentation, the same way that like a physical tool is an augmentation of my body, using software as a tool to think with. And so I have not gone down the cognitive science or the physiology direction with this work yet. So, but I think that's a very, very good question. Here's another one. Is the latent space for each work finite? If this would be the case, it reminds me of the Nietzschean eternal return to each work, regardless where we decide to show or manifest. I think that's a gray question or a fuzzy question to call it finite. It is finite, but it's also, I don't know if this makes any sense. We have like the Zeno's paradox applied to that as well. Like we do have a fixed set of numbers, which correlate to a fixed set of images, but we can always nearly always generate another image between those two images, and then another image between those two images, and another image between those images. But we get to a point where the difference between those images becomes unrecognizable or insignificant. So I think it's fair to call it a finite space. But depending on how things are trained, it can be an incredibly dense space. And I think another thing to say about the latent space is that it's not evenly distributed. There are areas of density within that higher dimensional space. And I think that is one thing about exploring them that is really interesting. And yes. Buñuel. Love it. Absolutely. For sure. And certainly. All the way through. I haven't really seen many of the films that were made in Mexico. So I think I've seen the early films and the later films. As I think you can tell from the work presented, I aesthetically work within really abstracted spaces that sometimes move towards representation and then back out. But the conceptual space of Buñuel's films and other surrealist and post-surrealist filmmakers are very much in my mind, I think, while I'm making this work. I think another straightforward question, good question. Can you type the tools that recommend for young artists to begin? Thanks. I mean, Runway ML is a really good tool. I guess I can put that in the chat. Oh, I don't know if I have access to the chat. Oh, there it is. But in terms of tools for getting into software and writing software, I think P5.js is a really strong tool. And of course, I'm really biased because P5.js and processing are tools that I either made or have had a hand in bringing into the world. But I think they're good ways of having an introduction to thinking in software. For me, software is not a technical medium; it's a conceptual medium. It is learning a new way to think. The same way that learning logic, if you're studying philosophy, is learning a new approach to thinking. Learning to write code is a pragmatic, hands-on way of learning a different system of thinking that's rooted and grounded in logic, but is about creating performative systems. When I didn't learn to code until I was in my late 20s, and it really reformed my mind, everything about it. It was really radical, and I think in some ways bad, and in a lot of ways good. Sound collaboration, for sure. One way that I really like to collaborate is through each individual in the collaboration doing their own thing completely and with autonomy. And so with this work with Jan, the video was completed and then it was passed over to Jan. And what we had agreed on was he produced an album called Spectric Acid that we both agreed would be the starting point for the audio. And after working on it a while, we realized that we needed a totally different approach to the sound. But the sound is 100% Jan's and the video is 100% mine. But it's a collaboration in that we both believe completely that one does not dominate the other, that the two are completely integrated. So I guess in the traditional role of collaboration, this wasn't like that. And I hope and think that we'll do that in the near future. But that's a little bit of the story of how that happened.
Kejsi, I noticed there was this one that you jumped over, I think by Natalie Pavlevska above. It's a little bit longer. Maybe it was very complicated, but I just thought I would point it out to you.
Could you translate that into a question for me? Is that?
It's
okay request.
That's why I was wondering if anything would trigger you there in terms of this reference to juxtapositions, sound and noise, and then time and space relations, different durations. It sounded like a question about a complex question about syntax, or she refers to a dialectical method. I didn't know how to, but I thought maybe you hadn't seen that one. But if it's don't feel
no, it's really good. It's really good. My brain is usually not working extremely well after I give a lecture because I've like put all my energy into being coherent. It's a really good question. The plasticity and the idea of montage, all the first experiments that I did with moving through the latent space for producing videos were in opposition to the idea of a cut. I really wanted to move seamlessly and fluidly through the latent space. After doing that and after generating a lot of material, I went back to cuts as a way of, I think it's just an essential, it's a really extraordinary tool for one frame, and then the next frame it's something different, and what that does in our perception, that I didn't want to let go of that. I wanted to utilize that. And so 3 of the 5 films don't have any cuts. 2 of them that we watched today do have cuts. I just felt it was a technique I wanted to have access to for producing these images, time-based images. I think in terms of like rhythm, a lot of it is also expanding and compressing time. So moving quickly, moving extremely slowly. Yeah, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to let you come to an end for that, since you have, it's incredibly challenging stuff, and I think challenging visually, conceptually. It puts me into a slightly, I don't know what the word is. It's not a dazed state. It's a very alert but slightly dazed state, and that dreaming stuff is going on. And I can't help but think that the fatigue that you are alluding to has something to do with that. Of course, you're much more familiar with it, but then again, you're much more deeply into it, and that may be related. I did want to say that from some of your last words, I'm so strongly reminded of things that Jean-François Lyotard had to think about, or tried to communicate to us about thinking, and saying it was so critical to unlearn in the process of learning and thinking. And you have been demonstrating that beautifully today and in your work. And I really want to thank you for that. So unless you want to jump in with something further, maybe we can end there, and I will just make a couple little announcements.
Maybe just one thing that I probably should have said much earlier, but just to get it on the record. This work is very much intended to be cinematic media. It's meant to be seen at large scale in relationship to our size. And it's in the audio, it's meant to be like very high fidelity and very loud. It's really sensory overload kind of media. And we weren't able to experience it in that way today because we're looking on screens of different sizes and probably dropping a lot of frames through the medium that we're showing it in. But I've found, just personally, experiencing it on a screen or other kinds of devices versus seeing it projected with like very good speakers as it was intended to be heard is a completely different experience. That's all.
Well, thank you so much. Let me just bring this to a conclusion by mentioning that we have a few lectures up and coming. In April, Aisha Liviana Messina will give something toward the end of the month. We don't have a title yet, but that will be out very shortly. We're also looking forward to Denise Ferreira da Silva, and again, not scheduled as yet, but coming. And also something from someone new to us, J.P. Huang, Chinese thinker, let me say, with an incredible background. And we will have events every month, at least, going into the year. And as some of you know, or I hope know, we have the ongoing Leading Thinkers seminars. Frank Ruda and I are finishing up. He's been working on Hegel. I've been working on Heidegger. In April, we start with Lacan and Deleuze. So if you're interested in a quite intensive seminar on either of those figures, check out our website. You'll see how to sign up. And of course, our normal programming starts in June as well, and you can learn about that on our website. So with those advertisements, Kejsi, I want to thank you again very warmly, and wish you all the best, in this challenging time. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. So.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Yeah, I'm really, really grateful. Thanks very much.
Take care. Thank you.
And thanks everybody for the good questions.